Thanks, Nick, and thank you, Scott Bushke, for putting this together on short notice. Hello, everybody. I recognize a couple of names, and there are new names in there as well. I'm looking forward to working with you in the near future. Couple things one thing I would correct out of the gate: while there is a commission on referred transactions, that's ultimately not the benefit, the main benefit that we're going to talk about today. Really, what this is, particularly in a down market, is seeing opportunities to transact where there would otherwise not be that opportunity. And on the flip side of that, creating solutions for sellers who would not have the possibility of making a successful exit. So it's about offering solutions to sellers where there would not be one otherwise, and creating transactions for yourselves as intermediaries where those transactions would otherwise not be possible. And that's really what we are going to chat about. Towards the end of the presentation, which is only about 12 or 13 minutes to get through the content here, I'm going to be turning it over to our CEO, Adam Dusso, who will walk through some of the qualifications and what to look for. And our president, Aaron Todron, is also on the line, and together they will be fielding your questions, which you'll be entering in the chat area here. And towards the end, I'll start going in through those questions and reading them out loud to everybody, and well, I'm sure it'll be an engaging discussion. So, again, wherever you are, I hope you're home safe. Thanks for showing up today. I'm sure by now that you've read a little bit about some of our, in some of our marketing materials about Article 9 and about how we deal with distressed situations. And one thing that I would correct in the title of this webinar, this isn't so much about, we don't want you to think about how to manage distressed situations. It's not so much that we're going to show you how to transact on distressed situations. We're going to show you how we remove distress from those situations so that you can transact business as usual. These are challenging times. The information and the collaboration that we're going to talk about today will offer you the opportunity to create transactions where you couldn't have, and like I mentioned before, to present solutions to owners who would otherwise not have them. And pardon me, I'm having a small technical difficulty changing the slides. Okay. Second Wind is a business consultancy based in Massachusetts. We're going on 12 years old now. Our history is in dealing directly with distressed business owners to preserve the underlying operational value of their business, of a business, and to extract it from distress, and to preserve that operational value in a new debt-free entity under new ownership. In doing so, we're able to preserve business value rather that would normally be lost to liquidation. And we're able to create benefit for all parties, creditors, business owners, and transactionalists alike. So before I get into the nitty-gritty, I just want to give you a bird's eye view of the solution that this company is founded on. Typically, when a distressed owner comes to us, they are familiar with two paths out of that distress. Perhaps a Chapter 11 filing, which I'm sure everybody on this webinar is doomed to fail most of the time, or perhaps taking out very expensive new debt mechanisms like merchant cash advances. And both of these things usually end up in the same place, which is liquidation of the business, its jobs. And what we do is we come in and we construct a multi-party solution. The first thing we do when a distressed owner comes to us is we approach the senior creditor, the bank. And we let the bank know that the business is winding down, that it can't support its debt anymore. It's essentially insolvent. We understand at that moment that the bank's recourse is to transact, is to liquidate, is to transact on its underlying collateral and take that collateral to auction. No bank wants to go to auction. It's messy, it's unpredictable, it's expensive. So what we do is we suggest that we can identify a purchaser for those assets, which we do. And when we identify a purchaser for those assets, we identify a single purchaser who is going to inherit all of the assets, both tangible and intangible, of that business with the intention of continuing to operate those assets. So they're inheriting the operational value of that business. They're inheriting the operation itself. The doors never close. The operation continues uninterrupted. The jobs are never lost. And the real magic here is that by virtue of this particular asset sale that we conduct with the senior creditor, and which satisfies their position vis-a-vis the defaulting borrower, all subordinate liens, debts, obligations are removed from those assets, which is what protects the senior creditor's ability to sell those assets in the first place to a third party with assurances that they come unencumbered. So that is how we divorce business value from distress. And I'll get into the mechanics of that in a little bit. At the end of the day, though, for our purposes, divorcing distress from value creates opportunities for sellers to create exits where they couldn't otherwise, for purchasers to access value that would otherwise be impossible, and for intermediaries to transact where they would not have been able to before. One way of describing the problem that we eliminate for intermediaries is this. A transaction often isn't possible because of debt. You can have an operation with a good history, good margins, good cash flow, but when there's too much debt on the balance sheet, when a seller is looking to exit, the number that they need does not align with what the market will bear. So you cannot align purchaser and seller. The reason those seller pricing requirements aren't realistic, as I'm sure all of you know, is because the number they need is the number that is necessary to make them whole, to resolve their outstanding issues and meet their other financial goals. And that is not in alignment with what the market will bear, even if the business were sellable. So typically distress is a dirty word for all of us. You know, time is money, and extracting value from distressed situations has traditionally been very difficult. There's been a high bar on it. Strategies involving turnaround, complex multi-party short sales, 363s, they're inefficient, they're time consuming, they can be unpredictable. And because of this, rightfully so, intermediaries would walk away from these situations. What the second win solution does is it extracts that business value that you want to transact on efficiently. We do this by aligning the incentives of all parties, sellers, purchasers, creditors. In doing so, we create opportunity for sellers to exit, for purchasers to access value without ever having to deal in distress. That's our job. One of the primary mechanisms by which we do this is what is called an Article 9 reorganization. And Article 9 is a set of provisions in the Uniform Commercial Code, which governs all commercial transactions across all 50 states. And it is one of the most powerful business preservation tools and even business investment tools that most people don't know about. It allows us to extract value from distress efficiently without Chapter 11s, without 363 sales, without complex short sales. And this can be achieved in a matter of 45 to 60 days. So let's talk a little bit about what this Article 9 sale is, what a UCC Article 9 sale is. As an overview, what it is, it's a controlled short sale of business assets into a new purchasing entity. The asset sale satisfies the senior creditor's position based on appraised asset value. Only the senior creditor's approval is required for the sale. By statute, all subordinate debt and liens are removed through the asset sale via Article 9. And if anyone on this webinar has heard of Article 9 before, or an Article 9 sale before, like most, you've heard of it in a liquidation context. Article 9s have traditionally been deployed for the sale of assets after a business has been closed. But at Second Wind, what we do is we execute the Article 9 sale on assets that are still operational and therefore still maintain their value, their enterprise value. The purchasing entity inherits both the tangible and intangible assets of the previous business. In the Article 9 short sale, business assets are sold to a single purchaser who intends to continue ongoing operations, such that the full enterprise and operational value pass through to the new debt-free enterprise, while the liabilities are left behind in the old entity. So at Second Wind, the way that we preserve value is by orchestrating these asset sales, Article 9, UCC Article 9 asset sales, on behalf of the senior creditor on the old business in one sale, one lot, one buyer. The reason we are able to construct a solution for a would-be seller that could otherwise not make a successful exit, and the reason that we can engage them to cooperate with their senior lender, with the bank in this asset sale while their business is still operational, is because we present them with an opportunity to avoid a bankruptcy, to avoid taking on new debt, to preserve the business that they built, And now the real magic part, to earn from the new company. There is nothing prohibiting the former owner from acting as and earning as a CEO, president, or earning in the form of a consultancy or some other form of employment agreement. And what that does, it provides them financial viability. Being able to earn in the NewCo allows them to resolve the personal guarantees that are left behind. So therefore, we construct a holistic situation to their solution that allows them to access the value that they've built in their business, but in a non-traditional way. So whereas they thought they needed to access that value through a traditional sale, we can allow them to extract that same value by transferring the underlying value of their business operation to a new purchaser and creating a path for them to earn in that new company. Just as a little recap, by creating that holistic solution, we enroll the distressed owner on behalf of the senior creditor who wishes to recover on their collateral without a forced liquidation. So by creating a better solution for that distressed owner and the senior lender, they work together cooperatively. The end result, debt is divorced from business value. Ongoing operations and enterprise value are fully preserved. Intermediaries are able to conduct a transaction based on underlying value without regard to distress on the balance sheet. A purchaser is able to acquire that business value at the cost of liquidated asset valuation, which satisfies the senior creditor on the old business. The seller is able to resolve outstanding liabilities without a bankruptcy and to earn. In intermediaries, they're going to have the potential to transact twice. They will transact on both the immediate transaction, which is the asset sale and employment agreement, which is associated with the reorganization and formation of the NewCo, and on any future secondary transaction of the new business. So the results of this Article 9 process that we coordinate are that sellers are incentivized with a successful exit, purchasers are incentivized by inheriting an enterprise at the cost of the assets, and intermediaries can seize opportunities that they would otherwise pass on. We like to express the value of an intermediary alliance with Second Wind as going from no deal to 2 commissionable transactions. The first transaction, like I mentioned, is the reorganizational transaction, which is usually complete in about 45 to 60 days. Pardon me. Recall that strategic purchaser who came in to stabilize the business and keep it from failing. There's going to be work to do, and that business is going to, over the next year, 2 or 3 years, be optimized to bring back to market. When that happens, the referring intermediary who brought us the situation in the first place will be the listing agent on that secondary transaction. So you're not only creating an immediate transaction, but a pipeline of future transactions as well, all from something that was something you would have walked away from. At Second Wind, the multi-party solution that we orchestrate, we like to refer to it as the 5 wins, the win-win, win-win-win. In this process, the winners are the first position creditor, the bank on the old business, who gets to sell their collateral for maximum value without having to go through forced liquidation, without having to deal with the time or expense associated with it. Winner number 2 is the seller, who creates a successful exit where they didn't see the possibility of such an exit before. The buyer is able to buy a business that would otherwise not have closed and at an entry price based on asset value. Subordinate creditors are able to write off toxic assets on their balance sheet, and in the case of vendors, perhaps even preserve a future business relationship. But not only that, subordinate creditors, because financial viability has been created in the NewCo for their guarantors, are far more likely to see the personal guarantee settlements resolved and met at what those settlement agreements what they are, rather than having to charge them off to a collections agency for pennies on the dollar. And most importantly, for the purposes of this webinar, is the intermediary, who has not only offered a solution to a business owner, would-be seller who would otherwise not have had a solution, but can now take what would have been no transaction at all and turn it into 2 commissionable events. With that, I'm going to turn it over to our CEO, Adam Dusso, to talk about what kinds of scenarios to look for and what some of the qualifications are. Adam?
Yeah. Hey, everyone. Can you hear me all right, Bob?
Yep.
All right, great. So yeah, Adam Dusso here, CEO at Second Wind. I'm going to take over from here, and you'll hear me hopping in once we get to the Q&A session as well. I appreciate everybody's time. So let's focus on what is a bad deal. How do you know this when you see it? Simply put, a bad deal for most intermediaries is when the market value of a business is less than the debt owed by a business. So if you do an evaluation and you realize that you're facing a short sale, that is one of what we classify as a bad deal. Another would be that the cash flow of the business does not support the debt service. So they may have a positive EBITDA, but when you put in full debt service payments, you realize that the business's cash flow is distressed. And that would be another deal that most intermediaries would walk away from. That is also a classification that may fall into a good fact pattern for Article 9. And the last is another way of stating a short sale is that the asset value of the business is less than the outstanding amount of the debt owed. So if you have more debt than you have in assets, the business is facing a level of insolvency and is therefore a distressed transaction that most intermediaries would not be able to transact on. So the simple way of putting this is ask yourself, would I sell this business if there was no debt on the balance sheet? Does it have strong, top line revenue? Does it have good gross margins? Is it in an industry where you have access to willing buyers? And if the answer to any of those questions is yes, that is an opportunity to bring that business to Second Wind and allow us to use Article 9 to make that transaction or make that opportunity transactable. In a matter of a few weeks, we could reorganize that business and remove whatever obstacle, remove the debt obstacles so that you can get at the underlying value and make a transaction through NewCo, which will not have any of those obstacles to closing. So the best way to put this is to go into an example. Larry Lancaster is a fake name, but this is a similar fact pattern that we have seen in the past and done a transaction on. So let's assume as an intermediary, you are contacted by a manufacturing company owned by Larry Lancaster. And you go in, you do initial due diligence. After speaking with Larry, you come to the following determinations: that the market valuation or the enterprise value of the business is $3 million. The asset valuation, based on what you understand from the balance sheet, is less than that, somewhere around $2 million. But the business itself has $5 million worth of debt. $2.5 million in SBA debt, $2.5 million owed to subordinate creditors. So neither the market valuation or the asset valuation are enough to sell this business and satisfy the outstanding secured creditors. So this is one of those fact patterns that we could use in Article 9 to take a transaction that was a bad deal and turn it into one that creates multiple opportunities. In this fact pattern, we would see an Article 9 for the $2 million, which is the asset valuation, plus an earnout for Larry Lancaster of roughly $1 million based on performance. What this allows us to do is that the first position creditor, which in this case was the SBA debt, they're going to get appraised asset valuation at no risk, time, or cost associated with forced collection value. They're going to get that from a buyer that we provide, and it's going to close in a matter of weeks with no costs. And because we've created an incentive for the seller in the variable earnout, Larry Lancaster has access to income that would help him settle the outstanding personal guarantees that he was going to owe the SBA bank and its subordinate creditors. So Larry, who was facing insolvency and didn't have a way to successfully exit his business and was probably slowly marching towards bankruptcy liquidation, found a way to sell his business for $2 million to the benefit of his first position creditor and $1 million in benefit to himself, which allowed him to avoid a personal bankruptcy and earn out of the new entity. The intermediary took a transaction that that would have not resulted in a closing and earns a commission on a $3 million valuation because brokers and intermediaries that we work with are able to commission on both the asset value and any variable earning component, earnout, consulting agreement, etc. So the entire transaction that would have been skipped over would have been $3 million, and the intermediary, by using Article 9 and Second Win, is able to commission on this transaction. Then the NewCo company, which we'll just call NewCo for the sake of this conversation, steps in and starts operating. They inject new capital. They may already be in the space and experience some synergies. Maybe they have lower cost of goods. 12 to 36 months later, NewCo is ready to be brought back to the market at a newer, higher value. So whatever the interim owner of NewCo is, came in to stabilize the company and raise its value. 12 to 36 months later, they should have accomplished that with a clean balance sheet, and the business can be brought back to market at a higher value, in this case, $5 million. So the intermediary also, by locking in that agreement at the closing of the Article 9 sale, got the listing for this subsequent sale. So what was no transactions turned into one transaction for $3 million, and then 12 to 36 months later, another transaction at a $5 million valuation. So the qualifications, what we get from this a lot of times is that, like, can this be abused to just avoid paying creditors? And unfortunately, the answer is no. And here is why. The Article 9 requires that adequate consideration be paid for the assets being sold. So if the asset value outweighs the debt on the balance sheet, there's no reason to do an Article 9. That business is not insolvent, it's not facing distress, and therefore doesn't need Article 9 in order to do a regular transaction. It's not a short sale. The borrowing business must also not have the asset base or the income to support full repayment. So if the business is solvent enough and has the asset base to fulfill its debt obligations, then what Article 9 would result in is that those obligations would be paid off anyway, and there would have been no need to do the Article 9 to begin with. And also a 10-day notice is sent to subordinate creditors that allows them 10 days to challenge the sale based on adequate consideration, which again, that isn't really an issue as long as this is done based on appraisal, or to allow them, really what this notice for is to allow them 10 days to foreclose up and take over first position if they were to do that. That never happens because the business is about to go through a short sale, so nobody wants to foreclose up to then take short dollars. So because these are short sales, that's not really a requirement it's not really a risk of these transactions, but you do have to give 10-day notice to subordinate creditors to give them the option. So by noticing subordinate creditors and following the requirements of an Article 9 sale, these things flow through and make sure that all parties are satisfied as part of this overall transaction. So the conclusion for everyone here is that intermediaries, M&A professionals, business brokers, they do not need to walk away from an opportunity because of too much debt. We need you to know that Second Win eliminates distress for the intermediary. We will line up all of the components for the Article 9 and collaborate with the secured parties to make it happen so that the end transaction looks pretty clean for intermediaries. You guys do not need to become specialists on the Article 9. You just need to know when the right circumstances are to deploy it. We also create an exit for distressed sellers. So I know you all have meetings with people who are looking for an exit and looking to you as a trusted advisor. This is a tool to give them when the market valuation doesn't meet the numbers that they need to successfully exit. We create value for purchasers. So any of you that maintain relationships with strategic purchasers or private equity groups, the opportunity to buy a business at liquidation value and at liquidation value while inheriting enterprise value makes you a very unique asset to those strategic purchasers and private equity groups, as that opportunity does not present itself on the open market too frequently. And lastly, without distress, you can conduct a transaction just based on value. So after the Article 9 removes the distress from the situation, this becomes a transaction like any other than the fact that we've removed all the roadblocks to a successful closing. So in the end, if you send us your bad deals, what we will do in a matter of weeks is turn around a great situation, which will be easy for you to close on and establish a relationship and a pipeline of future sales.
All right, thank you, Adam. Got some questions here. I'm going to bring those up and read them out. Jim Cumby asks, Adam, since the business debt is greater than market value, the only quote unquote win for the seller is to be relieved from the debt, right?
I mean, it depends on the situation. The short answer is no. Depending on their situation and how much of a negotiation we can have for their underlying personal guarantees, we have had people be able to earn above and beyond that, especially if they are going to continue to maintain an operational role in the company. They'll earn for the foreseeable future as one of the employees or managers of that company. Going back to the Larry Lancaster example, he earned $1 million in an earnout, and while he had millions of dollars of personal guaranteed debt, in often cases, we settle personal guarantees for pennies on the dollar. So he may have used 500,000 of that million to settle his obligations, and 500,000 would have resulted to him just as personal income. So it certainly is based on the circumstances of the individual owner. But that is not always a case that all they're doing is walking away for nothing. This will at least fund a successful exit to them and may allow them to earn above and beyond that.
Scott asks, Adam, if the creditor just needs to get paid in full and they have full control, who is our engagement with, and how do we get paid at close? Where does the money come from?
Yeah, so it's a great question. So first of all, not all first position creditors are getting paid in full. They're getting whatever their asset valuation is. Often cases, just like the Larry Lancaster example, it's a short sale even for the first position creditor. So that being said, even in those scenarios, you are allowed to commission from those transactions the way you would any other short sale. So you would get commissioned at closing if we can. When we negotiate with the first position secured creditor, they will be aware when we go into the negotiations that there is a listing with a broker. And because Second Wind isn't pulling out any brokerage fees at closing, they do allow a reasonable level of commissions to be earned at closing of the Article 9 sale. And obviously any earnout or variable component would be paid in accordance to you from the seller over time based on when those funds are received as it pertains to whatever earnout or consulting agreement was negotiated on the back end. So the simple answer is you'd be commissioned at closing just like any other transaction that you commission with. The only part that may be variable is the variable earning component to the owner that may require, you may get paid up front on that, you may get paid over time. That would be based on the circumstance of the negotiation.
Okay, and then Scott followed up by asking, does the bank remove PGs of the seller at the time of sale, or do they still have to pay after close if the junior lender is not paid in full?
The PG calculations come into play after the close because technically until the asset sale is completed, you don't know what the true deficiency balances are. And without knowing the deficiency balances, you can't negotiate personal guarantee settlements. So at closing of the Article 9 sale, what is being completed is just a release of the business assets. And then immediately thereafter, Second Wind sticks with the client and will stay with them as long as necessary to settle all of their personal guarantees. If it's only one creditor or two, that can typically be done in only a few months following the sale thereafter. If there are, dozens of creditors, the engagement with second win will be longer, but at least we will have secured the funds through the employment or earnout agreement.
Adam, Jim follows up with another question. He asks, how is it that the intermediary is guaranteed the listing on the second exit? And why do you assume that the second exit is 1 to 3 years?
Well, it's a great question again. At the execution or before a closing of the asset sale, once we get approval from the bank and we're preparing for a closing, we work with these strategic purchasers to enter into listing agreements with extended periods of time on them based on whatever the strategic objective is. So we can lock in a listing agreement prior to the close of the first transaction, which gives the broker exclusive rights to list that business if it's going to go back onto the market for a predetermined amount of time, 1, 2, 3 years, whatever is allowed within that state and is reasonable for the underlying client. The reason I state it's about 1 to 3 years is just basically based on anecdotal experience. There are certain businesses where you strip the debt off, and we've turned around and sold them weeks later, not months or years, but weeks, because once you remove the historical debt, that's enough of a financial turnaround to inherit and elicit a subsequent purchaser. However, most distressed businesses may need some traditional turnaround effort. There might need to be a CFO installed. You might need to input new management. You might need to find new suppliers. You might need to refinance your new debt and get into more traditional types of debts in order to have the profit margins that you want to have before selling. So anecdotally, I would say a year to 2 years is what it takes to position the new business to get its maximum value. But we have done an Article 9 in 1 month and sold it and flipped it the following month. It's just kind of a moving average.
Have one more here from James Benincasa, who I haven't met yet. And James asks, what is the minimum deal size? Who finds the buyer for the new company?
Minimum deal size, for this group in these times, we try to make sure that there's at least $100,000 or more in debt, and we really like to see that number north of $200,000. But really, we want to facilitate the relationships with this community and Cornerstone. So we'd be willing to look at any deal size that helped you guys, have the rubber meet the road here. When it comes to finding these strategic purchasers, we're pretty proficient at doing it, but also we work with M&A brokers and intermediaries. If you guys are able to help establish who this buyer is, we can kind of work on a team for this. Sometimes the best person is within the existing organization, and in other times, we need to look to a network of potential purchasers to find someone, and that's where an M&A alliance or a broker can really come into play. So the answer is, depending on the circumstance, either Second Wind can locate that buyer or the intermediary can, and we will vet out whatever is best for that individual circumstance.
Adam, Donald Ross asks, can you give an example of how the commissions to the intermediary works in an asset sale of $1 million, for example?
Sure. If the asset sale was $1 million and the commission rate of whatever was on the listing agreement is, call it, I don't know what the number is, 6, 7, 8%. Let's use 10% because it's a round number. Then that would be disclosed to the bank prior to them accepting that $1 million transaction, that there was a listing agreement in place and an intermediary was entitled to a broker's commission. So before the deal was even accepted and got to a closing, that would be cleared. And at closing, you guys would get $100,000 worth of commissions right out of closing, like any other transaction, and the bank would take the remaining proceeds. If there was on top of that, $500,000 earnout for the client that was paid quarterly, based on performance, then as the seller received those funds, the broker would be entitled to the 10% of that portion of the proceeds as well, and would have to be reconciled over a course of time. So when it comes to commissions, it's exactly like every other closing, because again, when you get to a closing, the distress has been removed, and this is like every other transaction.
This question is actually for me, and it comes from Nick. And Nick was asking if I could talk about the process. If an intermediary has a client or an opportunity that might be a fit, what does the referral look like? Who do they get a hold of? How do they engage the company in our process? So Paul Freeman, some of you know Paul. Paul is our Senior Alliance Manager. He is going to be your first point of contact when you think you may have an opportunity. For those of you that haven't met him yet, right after this webinar, I'll get together with Nick and I'll make sure that we arrange to make an introduction either by email or by phone so that you know who Paul is. When you have a potential opportunity, you'll pick up the phone or you'll send an email. The two of you will talk roughly about fact patterns and see if there's potential there. And if there is, we'll escalate it to engaging with the owner in at least a first conversation amongst yourselves, Paul, and the owner. And then from there, we would bring them in for a formal assessment to get into the more granular of it and proceed from there. But the short answer here is you would call Paul. Better call Paul. Scott asks, Adam, you asked about a lender approving a commission amount. What is the range that you've seen approved?
It depends. If it's an SBA lender, they cap third-party commissions, or last they released any regulations on this, they capped commissions as it pertains to commercial real estate at 6%. And as the ongoing concern business was 8%. So that number is the maximum amount allowed for SBA debts. When it comes to non-SBA debts, it's not as regulated. It's whatever is deemed commercially reasonable. So, whatever you would do in the due course of business, as long as you're not trying to increase your percentage amount because it's a distressed transaction, that is where banks will have an issue with it. So if it's commercially reasonable and it's a bank you've done a deal with before for a healthy deal and they've seen your commission rates and your commission rates are the same, then on the distress side of things, there won't be much of a problem at all. At the SBA, you can imagine, depending on the mix of collateral, somewhere between 6 and 8% of gross sale amount.
Question from Donald Ross. Adam, how does the second win get paid in the asset sale?
We don't. So the simple thing is that we represent distressed sellers, the debtors, and what they are going to do is we're gonna charge them a flat fee. So based on the number of entities we represent and the number of creditors we're going to be dealing with, we will create a flat fee. And based on the time that we expect to be working with these people, we will stretch that fee out over that period of time. So if we expect it to be 6 months, it'll be 6 equal installments. And if we expect it to be 18 months because of the number of creditors we have to do personal guarantee settlements, it'll be 18 equal installments. This allows the old business to afford our fees for as long as they are operating, and for the business owner to compensate us over time in a way that doesn't kill an already distressed cash flow. So we are not commissioned people. We don't act as brokers or intermediaries. While our work is a little adjacent to it, we are consultants. We charge a flat fee for the scope of services that we offer, and we stretch it out over time as to not stretch the cash flow of our clients.
I'll answer this one. It's Scott asked if we will do an assessment at cost, or what is the cost to see if you think you could help a client. And the simple answer is there is no cost. We don't charge to do an assessment or to evaluate a situation. And what I'm thinking is the actual typed questions, we've gone through those. I'm going to ask Scott if he would like to. Scott, if you want to unmute yourself and join the conversation and ask any final questions or jump in with Adam.
Sure. No,
Freestyle.
I appreciate you guys. Can you hear me okay?
Yep.
Okay, good. No, I appreciate you guys coming on board, and obviously, I think we've had an agreement with you guys now for a little bit, and hopefully this will help both sides maybe be a little more active on us getting some more things to you and you guys as you clean things up. Thinking of which alliance member would be the best fit to help you guys sell that company and monetize that opportunity. Obviously the times in front of us are unfortunate, but fortunately for you guys, I think it's we're going to see a lot more clients that fit probably fit in your wheelhouse. In fact, as I was sitting on this, I just got an email from one of our admin team and saying that, hey, we just got a hit off of our website for a distressed company that was looking to help with the sale. What do you want me to tell them? I was like, well, let me finish up this webinar and I'll reach out to you. But so I just think we're going to get more of those calls. So I think that I think there's still some questions out there of exactly how it works, but I would encourage everybody to the best way to learn is to bring, if each of us bring, one deal to you guys or to Paul, we'll see it firsthand exactly how it works and know that, we've got an agreement in place. You trust us, we trust you. It's all, for the greater good of the client at the end of the day and kind of really see how this thing all shakes out.
Yeah, I mean, I appreciate everyone's time. I would, Bob, I don't know if you want to just release the hounds and let everybody else out and be able to ask their questions. But Second Wind's all about preserving the underlying value of businesses here. So while what this is going to allow everyone on this call to do is take what is a challenging time and create a pipeline of opportunity, not only for yourselves, but for a lot of distressed business owners who need it. Businesses that were on the edge of insolvency all just became extremely insolvent. So
Right.
being able to be an M&A broker, whether or not you know how to wield this 100% or understand every increment of it, being able to have access to this type of information in this economic climate is going to separate the M&A community from those that know how to those who don't.
Okay, so now it's a good idea, Adam. I am going to open up the audio, but rather than doing it for everybody all at once, to keep it orderly, if you have a question or want to ask a question, just shoot something in that, and then I can go in and find you and unmute you. So Cliff Brown has a question. Cliff, you should be ready to go. We can hear you.
Yeah, can you hear me?
Yep.
Great. So I was hoping you could speak a little bit more about how the private or the personal guarantees are resolved. And then secondly, with respect to the overall Chapter 9, Article 9, excuse me, process, have you seen this work where the subordinate creditors are crucial vendors of the business that would be needed for them to continue as a going concern?
Great question.
Sure. Yeah, that is a great question. I'll start with the personal guarantee question first. So when the first position debt is SBA debt, the SBA actually has a process called the offer and compromise that is specifically designed to let personal guarantors settle for less than the amount that they owe. So that process takes some time because it requires the review of the federal government in the SBA reviewing the final offer. But that process is put in place for when businesses are liquidated and the underlying guarantor cannot pay as agreed in full. So that process is pretty well codified. I'd encourage anyone to look online about it. And if you have any other questions, I can do a deep dive with you on just that program for as long as you'd like and be more than willing to do that. All other personal guarantee settlements outside of the SBA are done oftentimes a lot quicker because there isn't that level of oversight. But it's based largely, what we do is a bankruptcy analysis of the individual guarantor. So based on their asset type and their liquidity, we look at them largely the way that we looked at the business, and we get a forced liquidation value of all of their assets, and we proportionally offer that to each one of their creditors. So in a way, this is like when we go to their creditors, it's not adversarial at all. If we've done enough due diligence and research, we can offer them, this is what you would get in a bankruptcy. We can offer you slightly more than that outside of a bankruptcy, or the alternative is you get the calculation under a bankruptcy proceedings. So given the fact that we're prefacing this based on the fact that this was a distressed, now liquidated business and only the guarantor is what remains, we're able to settle these debts. I think last year we settled on average SBA debts for 11 cents on the dollar. And other debts were, I don't have that number off the top of my head, and they range anywhere from 20 to 35 cents on the dollar. So we're able to cram down the amount of outstanding debt pretty drastically because the business is no longer part of the equation. All we're talking about is the assets of the underlying guarantor. So hopefully that answered your question. Maybe you'll have some follow-up. As it pertains to the vendors, what an Article 9 does is it does strip the vendor debt as well. But the great part about it is this is not a bankruptcy proceeding. So what the buyer can decide to do is create relationships or absorb some of the debt owed to certain vendors in order to keep an ongoing critical relationship. So what we do when it comes to vendors is go over with the existing business owner who is critical, who is not, and create a plan for each individual vendor. Most of that debt will be left behind in the old entity, but if some of it needs to transfer over, there's nothing that's stopping that from happening. The new entity can negotiate whatever arrangements it wants with each individual vendor. But the conversation is predicated on legally, the new buyer doesn't have any obligation to pay any of it. So it puts them in a strong negotiating position to at least, if they are going to take on any of that debt, be able to repay it in friendly terms, spread it out over time, maybe get a cram down of some of it. It allows us to have a full spectrum of options as it pertains to vendors, but all working from the standpoint of is there's not any legal recourse for them to take to try to get a better deal.
Great, thank you.
Okay, I'm going to look up and bring in Donald Ross. And just for everybody, you don't have to type the whole question. Just let me know you have one, and then I will unmute you. Donald, if you unmute yourself, we should be able to hear you.
Sure. My question is, who identifies the buyers to the transaction? Is it a collaborative effort between the broker and Second Wind, or is it strictly the responsibility of the broker? And then I think my second question sort of answers perhaps the first question, but before incurring the expense of retaining Second Wind, should the broker already have a buyer teed up?
So I think we touched this briefly. This is usually a collaborative effort with the broker. So if left with no identified buyer, Second Wind is pretty proficient at finding a buyer for this transaction. We have M&A relationships all over the country, so we can find strategic buyers, or we can work with the current owner to find someone within the organization or close to the organization who may have interest in stepping in, even if it's only for a short-term hold or flip of the business. So when we work with intermediaries, and they understand our process, oftentimes they come with a buyer in hand, but it is not a prerequisite. As it pertains to should they have a buyer in hand before they hire us, it all depends. If they are significantly in default with their creditors, then we need to act quickly, and the sooner we have a buyer, the sooner we can act. If they are not yet in default with their creditors or have just entered default, then it's not as critical that we have all the components right away. We will have some time to put the pieces together based on the fact that the bank has to send default notices, give time to cure, do things of that nature. So we can use that time and repurpose it to identify a buyer, again, likely in a collaborative effort.
Great, thank you, very helpful.
Okay, I don't see any more questions, so I'm gonna open it up to Nick. Nick, I turn it over to you.
Well, gentlemen, I appreciate the time. I think this was very informative and beneficial for the attendees to hear. And I think it would be equally beneficial for those who couldn't attend once we send out the link so they can access the discussion. It was great for me to hear too. I feel like I have a great understanding of the relationship and what Second Wind can offer our members. So I appreciate that insight and the time today. And, I think, how Bob, how do we, if we have questions, if we have, things, whether it's from me, gathering stuff from the members or each of the members wanting to reach out to you guys to just start the discussions, is the first point of contact for that kind of stuff still remain Paul? And we can send out the information on how to get a hold of him, correct?
Yep. And I'll work with you after this webinar to iron that out, but yes, it will be. And
Okay.
I wanted to, we had a late question come in and it's a good one. So if you don't mind, I want to back off of the closing statements and give Deborah a chance to ask this question. Deborah, you are unmuted. If you unmute yourself, we'll be able to hear you.
Okay, sorry about the lateness. So this is a multi-part question. Can an owner retain ownership or partial ownership during this process? And how does that process work if there are already several investors in play with partial ownership? And then thirdly, if you already have a strategic buyer that is interested, how does that factor into the play if they have no intention of reselling the business once acquired?
Wow, that was a really good three-party question. So let me try to let me try to break it down one step at a time. So the first question that you asked was, what if, or one of the questions that you asked was, what if you had a strategic purchaser in hand? Let me actually just start there. So if you had a strategic partner in hand and the goal isn't to bring this to market at a second time, then in that circumstance, what we would do is we could just do the Article 9 transaction right to whatever strategic purchaser you would like, and not all investment models are to subsequently flip the transaction. In our experience, a lot of these are because the buyer of the Article 9 transaction is stepping in largely in short notice because they see an opportunity to buy low and sell high. So more times than not, it ends at what is a secondary transaction. But if you come with a strategic purchaser in mind, call it a private equity group or a number one competitor, or whoever the strategic purchaser may be, we can do the Article 9 directly to them, and you can just commission off of whatever their the agreed upon purchase price is. Can you remind me of the other two parts of your question, just so I don't misspeak?
Yeah, absolutely. So can an owner go into this knowing that they want to retain partial ownership?
They can go into it knowing they want to, but at the time of the Article 9 transaction, the Article 9 transaction has to be arm's length. So the seller cannot be on both sides of the transaction. Okay. So this has to be arm's length. It doesn't mean that later on they can't preserve the opportunity to buy back in, or as part of their earnout agreement, they can't convert some of that into equity again in the future. But what it can't be a predetermined outcome as of the time of the closing of the Article 9 sale. You cannot be on both sides of the transaction. Okay. And as it pertains to other investors, that is largely the same on that end, although with the other investors, if they're not personally guaranteeing the debt, they could re-enter into the new entity if they wanted to right after the transaction closed. So they could have an equity option into the new entity. They could do any number of things. They're not personally guaranteeing the debt, so they can re-enter in on the other side. But again, at the closing of the transaction needs to be arm's length. So buyer and seller have to be different parties.
Okay. Excellent. Thank you.
All right. Nick, second part of your closing remarks.
I was pretty much done, but yeah, I think I appreciate the time, like I said before, and I will gauge the interest as well of the members with the information I send out and see if there's anything in the near future that we might want to set up as a follow-up to this discussion.
Great. And we have a lot of support materials. You know, we don't expect anybody to do the heavy lifting of explaining this to anybody or doing our jobs. So we have assets that are owner facing that we can give you and customize with your branding on it and things of that nature. Pretty much everything you could possibly want to remove as much friction as possible from engaging somebody into this discussion.
Perfect. Well, thanks, guys.
All right, everyone. Appreciate your time. Please reach out if you have any questions.
Thank you.